Hello and welcome to the 11th episode of the Wagner Students for Criminal Justice Reform podcast. With me today is Mr. Bogan. We previously alluded to this interview during the Basic Income Earth Network interview. And so welcome to the show.
Well, Thurston, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
So I first heard about your work reading the Washington Post. It was a headline, I think, on Facebook, something along the lines of paying criminals not to do crime, does it work? And as someone who supports the basic income and is also interested in criminal justice reform, this idea stuck out to me as perhaps an intersection between the two ideas. And I was particularly struck by the fact that your work seemed to be with people who were not marginal criminals, but rather people who would normally be characterized as hard cases. Could you talk about your work in Richmond?
For 8.5 years, beginning in late 2007, I began my journey as neighborhood safety director for the city of Richmond, California. At that time, that position and the Office of Neighborhood Safety was new to the city. In fact, the city made a decision that gun violence and its impact in the city of Richmond had gone too far, and having only a single sole approach to addressing it wasn't getting the city where it wanted to be as it related to its reduction metrics around gun violence. And so it created this new agency, the Office of Neighborhood Safety, of which I became the neighborhood safety director. And that office had one single mission, and that would be to reduce firearm assaults and associated injury and death. Now, this is a non-law enforcement agency, and it is inside of city government, the Richmond, California city government. And one of the first things that the agency, after hiring me, decided that we would do was to utilize a outreach and support mechanism in those communities most impacted by gun violence, to begin engaging young men, mostly, who were suspected of being the closest to this gun violence, in developing relationships from a non-law enforcement vantage point. I mean, all they had coming at them prior to this office was law enforcement. And again, the city found itself at a place of gunfire that was really outrageous. So, for example, in 2006, this city of 100,000 people, soaking wet, had 42 firearm-related homicides and more than 200 non-fatal injuries by firearm. In 2007, that number had increased to 47 homicides and 242 non-fatal injuries by a firearm. And again, those numbers by themselves are outrageous. For a city the size of Richmond, 100,000 or less, mentionable. And so by using this outreach engagement and support strategy, we would begin to develop a different kind of relationship with those individuals who were involved in gun violence, who had also avoided any criminal consequences for their suspected or alleged acts of gun violence. How would we do it? We would hire, prior to ban the box, we would hire what we would begin calling neighborhood change agents. Neighborhood change agents are full-time, fully vested city employees, but they all bring an experience to the work. They're formally incarcerated, and they have firearm charges in their backgrounds. So again, prior to Ban the Box, the city began to do something very bold and very different and quite innovative in terms of bringing into city government as full-time, fully vested employees to facilitate this very important work, formerly incarcerated men who themselves had experienced gunfire in the city of Richmond in their history. And their jobs would simply be to be deployed in these neighborhoods where gunfire was most prevalent, and to begin to be visibly present, and to begin to better understand what the nature of gun violence was at any given time in real time, and also begin to develop the relationships necessary to help these young men connect to available, accessible human or social service resources, to build relationships, positive, healthy relationships with these individuals. 2.5 years into this work, we began to appreciate that street outreach by itself, relationships, although important, not enough considering the socio-economic vantage point and experience of these young men, mostly young men involved in gunfire in this city. So we began to recognize just how dire things were in these communities for these young people. Two, we recognized that a very small handful of young people were in fact involved with gunfire. So much so that we felt we could really begin to better target our engagement with those individuals within these communities where we weren't spreading ourselves too thin. And by our ability to begin to target these young men more deliberately, much more intentionally, we began to learn a great deal more about them, their experiences, and their needs, but more importantly, their value to ending gun violence in our city. And as a result of appreciating that, one, if these young men aren't healthy, the communities they live in have no real chance of achieving their true health outcomes, or being able to maximize their true health outcomes. So we knew we had to make sure these young men increased their health opportunities. Secondly, we understood and appreciated and most importantly respected the fact that if we were going to achieve peace from gun violence in the city of Richmond, that peace would have to come through these young men. And therefore, we would have to partner with these young men in a way that would begin to help them make better decisions about how they negotiated or navigated the conflicts that they had to negotiate and navigate that often begot more and more gun violence in our city. So once we were able to identify and better engage the young men who were most responsible for gun violence, and I use the term suspected because they were all suspected by our own team, but also by law enforcement and certain community members, but not being prosecuted for those suspected acts. We were able to really begin to ask them and be directed by them in terms of what can we do to support your healthy growth and development, and to help you become a different kind of leader in your community. And what we learned was that, one, these young men were looking for supports and wanting supports. Once they began to believe that the opportunity was real, and that they were going to be listened to, and not only listened to but heard, they were willing to lean in themselves. They began to give us ideas. So, for example, we created a fellowship, I guess I should say, based on these ideas. Literally a postgraduate school-like fellowship specifically or tailored for young men who were suspected to be involved in gunfire, but also who had themselves avoided any criminal consequence for those alleged acts of gunfire. And what we learned was they wanted to be engaged by healthy individuals. And so we decided that we would engage them every single day. I mean, literally every single day, multiple times a day, by multiple positive, healthy people on our staff. The second thing we decided to do, based on information we received from them, was that we would help them develop goals for their lives. But we wouldn't simply give them a goal sheet and say, go do it, after we sat down with each and every single one of them and came up with a life plan. We would literally, each and every single day with our daily engagement, reflect on how they would go about achieving the goals associated with their life map. So essentially, they had someone every single day helping them negotiate their individualized or personalized life map. 3, we decided that we would refer them to only social and human service opportunities that would make sense. And by make sense, I mean would be responsive to who these young men were the day they decided to show up at that opportunity. And so we needed to find social supports that would meet these young men where they were, understanding the upstream variables that had failed these young men and understanding how that impacted the DNA of who these young men were today. And so we decided we would take them to every single social human service referral, and we would negotiate that service referral with them until they told us they were comfortable negotiating the service referral on their own. The fourth thing we would do, and here's where it gets interesting, is that we decided that we would provide what we call a life map milestone allowance. So essentially, we said, we're going to allow you to earn up to $1,000 a month based on your life map goal achievement. So as you are able to achieve goals associated with your individualized life map, we will provide you with an allowance of up to $1,000 a month for those goals that you achieve. And I think it's important to note here that the life map milestone allowance is not an incentive not to shoot. And I think that's where a lot of folks get a little off kilter with how they express or explain this allowance. It's completely tied to the work these young men put into achieving goals aligned with their life map. So for example, they have housing goals. And so if we can work with this young man to help him identify and obtain safer housing or living situation, there's some incentive or an allowance assigned to that based on his efforts to identify this new situation. Education, if he decides to re-engage or re-enroll in an educational opportunity, there is an allowance assigned to that. Employment, career, health, mental health, behavioral health, medical health, recreation, all of these things within his life map, he has an opportunity to earn up to $1,000 a month, but only for 9 months out of the 18-month fellowship engagement. So we're talking about a $9,000 expenditure for those who are able to tap into that total $9,000 line item per fellow. The fifth element of 7 is the transformative travel. And I would tell you, I think this element is probably the second most attractive element of the 7 after the daily engagement multiple times a day by our staff. And yes, I would say the multiple daily engagements are the most attractive as by the fellows through evaluation. But the second most, not the stipend or the allowance, but the travel. So the way the travel works is that young men who are part of one gang, and I use that term because that's how most people understand these young men, not that I consider them a gang or being in a gang, but we'll use that term for the purposes of this interview because I think it helps people to understand what I mean when I say young men traveling with folks that they hang out with every single day are able to do that with peer fellows throughout the state of California. That is to say, they can travel throughout the state of California together with the Office of Neighborhood Safety staff. And as they travel throughout the state of California together, they're able to visit universities, do community service work that they're not able to do in the city of Richmond because of safety issues. They're able to meet with very important people like mayors or city administrators, college presidents, deans, chiefs of police, whoever I might be meeting with on these different transformative travel opportunities. These young men get a chance to meet with them. They get a chance to talk to mothers in those cities who've lost their own sons to gun violence. They get to talk to kids about the ills of gun violence. They might even work with the elderly or feed the homeless. They get a first-class opportunity to enjoy themselves, something they don't get to do in the city of Richmond often. And so it's really about helping them see a world that they have no idea exists. Why? Because we want them to be able to hope and dream, something that for most of them, they have lost the ability to do because of their current circumstances and situations and environments. So we're trying to blow their minds on life when we take them out of the city of Richmond. However, there's another opportunity for travel. With all of those specific engagements that I mentioned around the California-oriented travel, these young men can travel out of state with us and out of the country with us. The only difference is they have to be willing to travel with someone that they're trying to kill or with someone who is trying to kill them when they travel out of state or out of the country with us. And I will tell, yeah, I think, and this is really a major part of this work happens here at Element 5, the transformative travel, because we've taken several out of state excursions and certainly several out of the country excursions. And the common theme with each of those kinds of excursions or transformative travel is that we are traveling with rival groups, rival associations. And so when we're able to get these individuals to a place where they are willing to take that big leap, we know we are getting closer to the difference that we are trying to create in our city. And we've had no challenges or lethal challenges or violent challenges as it has related, or experiences or incidents as it's related to this travel opportunity. In fact, it has become a much more popular element than it was when we first introduced it to our fellows back in June of 2010. But as groups of fellows have taken this leap, they can't help to come back home and talk about the experience. And I'm talking about grown men between the ages of 18 and 27 years old who haven't been out of the country or haven't been out of the state for that matter, who are in fact traveling with folks that they've been trying to kill for some given time. The sixth element of 7, Council of Elders in front of these guys to help facilitate our life coaching and our life skills framework. Elders are men of color, typically, who are nearly retired or retired, who aren't afraid of these individuals that we're engaging and who are willing to meet them where they are and share their life experiences, whether it be one-on-one or in a group setting. And we create weekly group settings where this can happen. And it's been pretty remarkable experience for these young men to meet men that they wouldn't normally or naturally meet in their own neighborhoods, who have had successful careers, have healthy families, and they're interested in helping these young men transition and become successful and to stay alive and to stay free. And then finally, the seventh element of our fellowship is the subsidized internship. So we used to get these young men jobs because they used to tell us that that's what they most needed. And that was something that we were able to do in partnership with the Employment and Training Department with the City of Richmond. We were able to get expedited service and opportunity for these young men because we were also a government entity. But we continued to learn that these young men weren't ready for jobs. They weren't even ready for the job training mechanism, nor were the jobs available ready for these young men. And so rather than set these young men up to fail and to set employers up for headaches, we decided to spend the getting them jobs to create the seventh element of the subsidized internship, which is after 18 months of their engagement with us through this fellowship at a different place than they were on day one of their fellowship. And what I mean by that is they're much more mainstreamed and they're much more able to handle authority and handle a variety of personalities that may in fact conflict with their own. But we're at a better place in that we have a better appreciation of who these young men are, what their interest is, passions may be. And so what we do is after 18 months is we identify internships based on their interest and their passion and their maturity levels, and we place them with those intern opportunities, and we subsidize it with a $20 an hour wage, 20 hours a week for between 9 and 12 months, asking the employer that if this individual proves to be valuable to their organization or company, if they'd be willing to keep him on longer on their own dime. And that has just worked better for us, even when we've had to raise additional dollars because the employer or organization didn't have the resources for the additional expenditure. It's just been a better opportunity for both the fellow and the employer when we've approached it that way. That is the fellowship. So it's much more than a stipend or paying young men to stop shooting. It's pretty comprehensive. It's very developmental in its approach. It's community driven in that it embraces and reflects the voice of the fellows themselves, the young men themselves. And it's responsive in that it understands the trauma that these individuals have experienced, whether it's direct or indirect, vicarious, untreatable or untreated trauma. It is responsive to who these young men are. That is what it is. And as a result of doing this, since June of 2010, we've had 4 completed cohorts of fellows. That's 84 total fellows since June of 2010. And of those, now I want to emphasize something before I give you the impact. These are young men who are suspected of committing firearm offenses. These are young men who on day one of their fellowship believe that they are committed to gunfire as a lifestyle option of protecting themselves or defending themselves.
Yeah,
these are young men,
cases.
Right. These are young men who we believe would be dead within 6 months of their fellowship offer. And since June of 2010, 94% of our fellows are alive. 83% of our fellows haven't been injured by a firearm since they became a fellow. And here's the biggest number of them all. 77% of our fellows are not a suspect in a new firearm crime based on law enforcement data since becoming a fellow. And that translates into a 71% reduction in firearm activity causing injury or death in the city of Richmond.
And that's because typically firearm violence is committed by a very small percentage of the population, and you've managed to target those and treat them.
That's
right.
That's correct. Small, I mean, and that's really important. A handful, what we like to call 1%ers, are often responsible for senseless gun violence in our urban communities. The challenge is that rarely are there social service mechanisms available to these individuals. And by available, I mean prepared for the individual and with the capacity that the individual can be prepared for it.
Yeah, I mean, for me, this is incredible because it basically flips the existing model on its head, which is sort of, we look for what we consider like marginal criminals, people who are unlikely to, or rather, more likely to be impacted by treatment. Those people who are not in the 1%.
That's correct.
And we try to prevent them from becoming worse. Whereas your program targets the 1% and treats them.
That's
that's kind of like a triage model almost. And
yeah.
it's had a massive impact from what I understand.
Absolutely. It definitely has had an impact. And I think anytime you're able to do a couple of things, one, identify the individuals who are believed to be most responsible for your city's gunfire, and you're able to create a responsive mechanism to engage them in a way that's credible and legitimate to the young men themselves, that makes a big difference. And it begins to help create the conditions for transforming the communities or neighborhoods where these young men live versus, our typical approaches to do law enforcement sweeps where we take guys off the street for a limited period of time, where it leaves a vacuum to be filled, and that vacuum gets filled. And then eventually those guys that have been taken off the street come back home untreated, unengaged, and fall right back into what they know to do as it relates to gunfire happening in their communities when they return.
So the travel and stipend remind me of the story, and I forgot the economist's name, and I apologize ahead of time. But he had written a ton of books and published many, many studies. And he was brought before Congress as an expert. And one of the congressmen asked him, can you summarize your work in one sentence, which is usually something experts cannot do. And he stands up and he says, incentives matter, and then sits right down. And how did you go about designing your program? Because one of the things I found incredible about it is the fact that there seemed to be an awareness of sort of like designing incentives into the program that all pointed in the right direction.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for us, it was really, like I said, I mean, I think one of the first things we did is we decided to sit down with a group of these guys and ask them, why do you do what you do? What's having an impact on you in your community? And a couple of things happened for us, because they didn't say we need money, but they definitely talked about, why. They definitely talked about the economic pressures and stresses that they're negotiating in their communities. But for me, Thurston, let me tell you, what I learned in a lot of pre-work here was that so much money, many resources had been developed to reduce gun violence in the city of Richmond, very rarely did any of those resources that had been raised or developed ever reach the young men most responsible for the gun violence in this community. So for us, it was a matter of making sure that that didn't happen again. You know, we saw 20 years of significant gun violence here where nearly 700 young men were murdered in the streets of Richmond, and millions upon millions of dollars had been spent, raised, and developed. And rarely, if ever, did any of those resources outside of law enforcement oriented resources reach any of those men who were killed on the streets here. So we just felt like, you know, one, that shouldn't happen. Two, these young men have a great responsibility for the development opportunities, the economic development opportunities in this city. There's a great deal of data out there that basically and clearly communicates that where you have significant levels of gunfire, economic development is poor and stagnant. And it certainly falls sharply. And so knowing this, we felt like, hey, let's help these young men use their leadership assets and capacity in a different way. As hard as that would be, try and let's compensate these young men for the work they're putting in to develop their own lives that eventually will impact the economic development opportunities indicators in this city. Why not? So for us, it was much more practical. And it was also, you know, how much money we're spending on the other end. You know, Mother Jones did a expose on the cost of gun violence, and they tend to believe that the researchers and scientists that were part of their study believe that every time someone is injured by a firearm in this country, and we're paying for 32 of these a day, it's a cost of about $400,000 to the taxpayer. Well, we're spending what, $18,000 a year per fellow, and that includes the staff time with engaging this fellow the way that we do daily. It's not a lot of money when you consider or compare the front end cost for preventing and intervening versus the back end cost of chasing carnage, and that's what we tend to do. But paying attention to these young men and their realities was significant to why we introduced this allowance into the fellowship. But I have to tell you, bro, yeah, incentives matter. I definitely agree, but they don't have to be cash incentives. I'm going to tell you, this travel incentive, I think, has much more of an impact on the fellows as they're doing the work. And it's probably one, like I said, the second most attractive element of the fellowship that makes the offer of this fellowship attractive to those that we offer it to ongoing.
So one thing that you've said twice is that the members of the community that you're working with have leadership assets, which
yes,
I agree with. And in my own work, I've started to refer to what people usually call drug dealers as either informal market entrepreneurs or black market entrepreneurs, because these, 16 to 25-year-olds have small business experience that most of us don't. They know how to, manage cash flow, and if they are sort of a leader among their peers, they tend to have to basically manage payroll.
That's right.
The prisoner entrepreneurship program in Texas is a program that I've looked at in the past, which sort of looks at them and goes, all right, you've got entrepreneurial experience. Like, how can we develop this by the time you leave prison, so you can become your own boss? Because we all know that finding a job with a history, or in this case, suspected history, is impossible. Like, oh, well, not impossible, but it's incredibly difficult.
Sure.
So that's another thing that I think that a lot of the criminal justice reform is missing, which is sort of like, how can we find these skills that these kids have developed in their uh, what we consider criminal behavior?
That's
Uh,
correct.
so
No, that's correct.
yeah,
That's correct. Not only being able to identify it and find it, um, draw it out, extract it, uh, but also the willingness to create the infrastructure where you're able to go long and deep with the individuals that we're talking about. I mean, these individuals come to the table with a great deal of very poor prior experiences navigating systems, um, the maze of of systems, haven't treated these individuals well, or their experiences with them haven't been healthy. And so we can't create systems that declare these young men ineligible because they bring the very attitudes and behaviors to the table that speak to why we created the systems in the first place. So what I mean by that is, because that may have sounded cumbersome, an example is if we develop an anger management program, and this young man finally shows up because he comes to peace with, yes, I have anger management problems, and I show up angry, and folks at the program thank me for coming, but they tell me to come back when I'm not so angry. What sense does that mean for me? And this is a common experience. So I think there are a lot of opportunities for entrepreneurship and services and resources out there that could be beneficial to these young men on the surface. But what happens is, because of who these young men are, and that's what I mean by the DNA, their DNA and the upstream variables, because of who these young men are, they often become ineligible for these opportunities as a result of who they are. So the opportunity itself is not enough. It's an opportunity that understands who these young men are and is willing to meet them where they are and go long and deep with this young man to get that potential out of him.
so speaking of this 1%, what could you like create sort of like an image, like a composite of what sort of characteristics they have? Like, who are they? So maybe
Yeah,
so the audience can understand who you
sure.
work with.
So yeah, so first and foremost, between the ages of 16 and 27 years old, sometimes a little older, certainly sometimes younger, mostly men of color, in a city like Richmond, California, mostly African American boys and men of color, or Hispanic boys and men of color, from neighborhoods that are significantly under the poverty line, poor education. Most of these young men have dropped out of school during their middle school years. Some certainly drop out after they've entered high school, but most during their middle school years, and haven't had a great deal of contact with public systems since they've dropped out of school, unless they're being engaged by law enforcement. Most of them have been a victim, whether it be direct or indirect, but a victim of gun violence. That is to say, they have inherited an experience of gunfire that has plagued their communities since their childhood, if not infanthood. Uh, they have been shot directly. They've experienced a great deal of death, whether it be family members or friends or associates. Most of the time, they're fatherless in that their fathers have either been killed or their fathers are in jail and have been in jail for significant amounts of time of their development. Most of these young men are in families where their mothers are overwhelmed with multiple children, and where the mother does have a job, she's got two jobs trying to create a survival opportunity for these families. They're mostly living in public housing situations. Um, they are negotiating, as I mentioned earlier, a crazy amount of untreated trauma that they've experienced. It's akin to growing up. I want to imagine it can be akin to growing up in a war zone, like of Israelis and Palestinians, where you grow up, you're born into a war zone where the enemy is those people over there, and you grow up believing that you've got to defend your neighborhood and protect it from the violence that it has experienced since you showed up on the planet, that you've experienced directly or indirectly yourselves. These young men aren't working. They're not prepared for work. And like I said, they're not prepared for the mainstream social services platform. And they bring a great deal of anger, a great deal of fear, and a great deal of pain with them. And so you've got to understand how to embrace that upon your initial contacts with them, because these are the young people who see you coming and run from you, whether it be physically run or emotionally run from you, seen you before, and all you've represented to them is anger, fear, pain, and failure. Completely disconnected young people from the mainstream society, but also young men with, like I said, a great deal of talent, a great deal of asset, a great deal of value, a great deal of leadership. The environments they live in and have to navigate and negotiate are environments that you or I couldn't successfully live in, negotiate, and or navigate. And the leadership capacity that many of these young boys have to have followers, to get others to join them in going on missions. You know, they go on missions and they know the likelihood of them making it back is slim, but they go anyway, all to benefit what they believe is benefiting their neighborhood, their community. Now, I'd like to share this real quick analogy with you. And I'm not condoning what these young men do, but I want us to understand what they do better than we might understand it, because our ideas about who these young men are is the substance of our behavior and how we approach these young men, how we treat these young men, how we in fact see these young men. So this analogy that I want to throw at your audience, I don't want it to be offensive to anyone. I just want it to be used as a thought mechanism of maybe looking at these young men in this way. So for example, when the Twin Towers destroyed by terrorists, and we as a country eventually identified Osama bin Laden as the author of those acts, we continue to use language that said we are out to bring this individual, Osama bin Laden, and anyone associated with him and these terrorist acts to justice. And it took us some time to do it, but we spent a great deal of resources and took every opportunity that we possibly could over that 10-year or so period to actually bring Osama bin Laden, and certainly a lot of others, to justice as a result of what happened in New York City on September 11th. And so the night that President Obama announced that we had eventually and finally killed Osama bin Laden, I remember it like it was yesterday, but I remember the number of people that converged onto in front of the White House with the flags and folks waving flags. And there was just a great deal of patriotism and excitement that we had finally brought Osama bin Laden to justice. Excited. Now, think about that for a second. Think about where you were when that happened. What, and I'm talking to the audience now, and how you felt about your country and being able to finally get the guy who had brought terror to so many Americans in New York and death. I want you to try to imagine for a second that in urban neighborhoods where these young men live, every time another neighborhood, in essence, another country, comes over and shoots and violates and maims and or kills someone from my neighborhood, they have just flown their plane into my tower. And I don't trust that the community or the police are going to be able to bring the individual or individuals responsible for that to justice. And so I find myself born into an environment that teaches me that that is my responsibility. I'm a soldier, and my responsibility as a soldier is to find Osama bin Laden and bring him to justice, or essentially revenge. Get revenge for my hood. Get revenge for my country. These young men are simply playing out what they know and what they learn, not just from their own neighborhoods, but from this country and the history and experiences that this country often plays out on its own enemies. And I just want folks to understand and try to appreciate it. And I'm not condoning it. I'm saying understand the mindset that says I'm a soldier for my neighborhood, and those guys over there flew their planes into my towers. It is my responsibility, because nobody else is going to do it, to go over here and get it. Now, when I say nobody else is going to do it, I can imagine that folks would say, well, that's what the legal system is for. That's what the criminal system is for. And I would just say to you, let's look at Chicago, for example. Everyone's talking about Chicago because more than 740 people lost their lives to gun violence in Chicago in 2016. And I want to say more than 3,000 people, it could have been more than 4,000 people, were injured by a firearm in Chicago in 2016. Now, the criminal legal justice system, I'm certain, is doing their best to bring
there's a lot
those
of unsolved cases.
right,
Yeah.
to bring those people responsible for justice. But the folks in Chicago will tell you they're going to bring less than 25% of those people responsible to justice. And so you have 75% walking the streets with nothing else coming at them but law enforcement. If that's all we've got coming out at these young men and or women in these communities but law enforcement, we can count on more gun violence being a result of that, because we're not engaging them in different kinds of ways that actually begin to help them develop and change their response to the gun violence that they experience on the daily.
Similar observations have been made about the sort of Chicago crisis, which, you know, I think speaks to sort of how these environments are a little bit different, where a returning Iraq war veteran came back to his community, and he was talking to, like, his younger brother, and he realized, like, his younger brother had PTSD like he did.
Yes.
But his little brother didn't go to war.
Right.
His little brother thought like a soldier, though.
Yes.
And had seen his best friend killed.
That's right. That's right, Thurston. These young men are, like I said, the trauma experience that these young men are negotiating is crazy. It's outrageous, and it certainly is unacceptable. And it rarely gets treated. I mean, it rarely gets treated because we continue to try to approach and treat this by way of a mechanism or an approach that just isn't responsive and certainly not credible and legitimate in the eyes of the individuals that we're outreaching to. And I'm talking about mainstream. And then what typically happens is when we're not able to engage these young people who have experienced this amount of trauma and PTSD effectively, we tend to blame and re-traumatize the young men for our inability to connect with them in a way that has a meaningful impact that yields high results. And I think what we're doing, albeit harder work, it is certainly hard work, and it requires a great deal of training and a great deal of time, and in fact, more costly than your typical mainstream per client engagement. I believe it's effective because we're able to, in fact, engage that one percenter in a way that actually makes sense to the one percenter. And when you're able to engage that way, they are much more collaborative in their treatment plan. They're helpful to it. And that's what we need.
And in terms of the like dollar per client amount, I think that the like more that's true that people look at it from that metric, but I imagine that the metric of sort of like community-wide gun violence would be more appropriate, given that these are like the 1%ers. So if I treat like a marginal client and I treat a 1%er, if I can reduce the 1%er's gun violence, then that's going to have a larger impact on the community.
That's so right. That's right. And the challenge, so you're right. You're spot on with your analysis. I think one of our challenges as a society, and this speaks to what we've been raised on, is that we still are heavily dependent on our belief that law enforcement is the answer, no matter what the cost. I mean, law enforcement or criminal justice versus procedural justice is the approach. And then secondly, this idea that these young men that we're talking about, I can't tell you, Thurston, how difficult and how much pushback I get even today, even with the results. Why would we spend those kinds of resources on young men who should, in fact, be in jail? They have committed a crime. In fact, they've committed a very lethal crime. And my answer is simple. This is not a get out of jail free pass. Even when these young men change, they know that if there's no statute of limitations associated with the crimes they're suspected of committing, so they know they can change and do so well in their lives and improve themselves. And eventually, if the evidence and witnesses show up, they've got to come back and now answer to that. But the fact of the matter is, they aren't having to come back and defend themselves. Most gun crimes in this country go unsolved, particularly urban gun crimes in U.S. urban neighborhoods. And so I think we've got to be much more reality driven also as we make judgments about how and who we spend resources on.
Not to mention, even if they do go to prison, like, what is it, like 95% of people who go to prison come back to their community?
The great point. We're spending $71,000 per year per inmate for adults in California. And 90% of those folks are going to come home. Well, they say 70% of those guys are coming home, and 90% of them will find their way back to that prison within 3 years of their release. And so we're wasting a lot of money. That's a crisis.
Yeah. Do you think that the fact that you were part of municipal government rather than a branch of the law enforcement had any impact on your ability to do outreach?
I think there are ups and downs. I do, but so yes is the answer to the question. I think, and I like to, and I'm often remiss in noting this, but the street outreach workers, the original group of street outreach workers that we hired in 2008, remain with us today. And I think that's another very distinct element between the kind of work we do and other violence interruption or violence prevention intervention efforts. We've been able to retain staff for longer periods of time, and I think it has a lot to do with the staff being allowed into government, staff that would have not traditionally been allowed into government jobs, to be allowed into government jobs and to be paid a livable wage and to have the kinds of benefits that government allows its employees. So it's allowed us to get a quality of staff that's translated to, and to retain a quality level of staff that translates into trust on the streets. So in that regard, yes. With regard to our engagement and our relationship with the local and regional law enforcement players, it's a marriage. And the best of marriages have hurdles that they have to jump over and get over. And there are healthy disagreements and skirmishes in healthy marriages. And I can tell you, we, albeit a government agency, have had our share with our other government counterparts in law enforcement. But I do think it's probably a lot less because we're a government agency. So again, yes, I think it certainly has had an impact on our work and the success that we have had in our work. And then finally, I think being a government agency gets us closer to better data from the other public systems, collecting it, where they collect it, and allowing us to have access to data that many non-governmental entities rarely have access to because of the HIPAA laws. So on. So I think us being able to get access to good data, and then to be able to have what we do corroborated by law enforcement is a pretty big deal. It's great for our investors to hear when law enforcement communicates that, one, this entity is working with the one percenters, a group of people that no one else in our city is engaging. And then secondly, to corroborate the results. As a result of their working with these one percenters, we as a law enforcement collaborative can tell you that 77% of these guys are no longer on our radar for at least new gun crimes since they began engaging this agency. So that's huge when we're able to get that kind of corroboration around impact and results.
So having worked from the outside in the sort of the nonprofit world, I tell you that I'm envious of people who are on the inside who have access to data. Data do you collect?
Well, there are 3 data points that I'm most interested in, and I've given them to you earlier. One is this young man alive, and that's the impact data. I'll go backwards in a moment. 2, have they been injured by a firearm? I mean, that's, I want to know. And I want to know this. I want to know, have they been injured prior to our contact with them? And how many times have they been injured by a firearm? I want that kind of data as well. And we're able to get that from what at least law enforcement and our trauma center is willing to provide, or our county is willing to provide. And then that most important data is, are the guys we're working with through this fellowship, are they the 1%ers based on the best law enforcement intelligence out there? And two, after our engagement, are they still on your radar for new gun crimes? I mean, and so it's great to be able to have law enforcement sit down with us and say, the guys that you're working with are the guys, prior to your working with them, are the guys we're targeting for advanced law enforcement pressure and attention. And we don't have the evidence or the witnesses we need to prosecute, but these are the guys that we believe are responsible for the gunfire in our city. That's a very important data point for us to have access to. And then for them to come back after we've got this guy engaged for a period of time to say, hey, how did you guys get him quiet? How did you get him to put the gun down? How did you get him to be less active in this this war within this city? That's a powerful message for us to receive when law enforcement comes back with data and says, hey, he's not on our radar for anything new since you all have been engaging him. And or for the 20 or so percent of them to say, hey, although we're not able to prosecute this guy, he's a fellow and he's still active. That's information I need to know. If I'm not getting it from the street outreach apparatus, it's great when law enforcement says, hey man, this dude is active. We need you to put a little more time and attention into this guy. That's the kind of data and insights that I need, and having access to it has been helpful to us. The other data is obvious. You know, we want to know, you know, how many criminal justice contacts have these young men had prior to their engagement with us, whether it's simply contact by law enforcement, or even has he or she been prosecuted for a gun crime in the past? If so, how many times? Where did the prosecution go? I mean, those are the kinds of things that we're looking to know about this young man prior to our engagement with this young man.
So what is your work like now? You've been working on this for about 8 years.
Yeah, well, the work today is different. You know, one of the great things about the Office of Neighborhood Safety in the city of Richmond is anytime you create an entity with one sole mission, and that is to reduce firearm assault and associated injury and death, and that's all you focus on from a non-law enforcement standpoint, you learn a lot about trending and what's going on in real time around firearm assault incidents in one city. And so, you know, when we got here, there was a great deal of neighborhood against neighborhood, or what law enforcement would term gang-related gun violence, happening here at very high rates. That has changed significantly, and much of the gunfire that we achieved or experienced in 2016 was less about rivalries and more about domestic disputes and within groups of people who knew each other from the same neighborhood. And so you see that the nature of gun violence, you begin to see the shifting of gun violence in our city as a result of this mechanism, the Office of Neighborhood Safety. And so what this has allowed us to do now over the last 8 years is we're now able to go a little further upstream, and we're spending more time because we we aren't as we're not as what's the word I'm looking for? We have more room and more resources available to us to now go upstream, because we're not as burdened by the active firearm activity that once was in our city and those who perpetrate it. So we're now able to begin to look at young people growing up in these war zones within these neighborhoods who have yet to pick up a gun, but are exposed to and have been exposed to a lot of that, who aren't being engaged by any other mainstream social service apparatus within our city or within our county. And so now we're beginning to engage those young people so that we don't have future fellows in them. And so a lot of what I'm doing now in this city, because I can, and in this county, because I can, just based on what the nature of gun violence is today versus yesterday, is trying to convince and encourage the social services mechanism to shift in such a way that it too can now go into that war zone, a war zone that it hasn't been engaging in, and begin to engage those younger people who aren't coming to the community centers or to those social service agencies for help, to outreach to them directly and draw them in so that they won't become the next firearm victim or firearm perpetrator. So that's one aspect of what we're doing here on the ground in the city of Richmond, because the nature now allows us to do it. Because of our past work with the fellowship, you have more cities, I think, beginning to appreciate this need to go deeper and to go longer to achieve the high impact results that they're desiring to achieve as it relates to gun violence reduction and increased public safety in neighborhoods that have been besieged by gun violence in the past. So we're spending more time in educating people on this Office of Neighborhood Safety mechanism as an opportunity within city government, as well as this fellowship or the Richmond Fellowship model as an opportunity that can happen inside city government or it can happen outside of city government. But this fellowship opportunity of engaging these young men in a very deliberate, intentional, very persistent, deep in way to achieve the kinds of results that we're trying to achieve in our cities as it relates to reducing gun violence and increasing public safety.
Well, here at Wagner, we are watching your work and we are incredibly hopeful for the future and thankful for the work you've done so far.
Well, I thank you for this platform, and I thank you for the opportunity, because I think the more folks become educated and informed, and I mean community level folks as well as public system level folks, about what it really requires to reduce gunfire and to help develop those who are involved in gunfire. I think folks understanding what it really requires over time will bring folks to the conclusion that this is a wise investment and a wise approach in getting where we all say we want to get, without threatening the role and function of other entities and agencies also committed to reducing gunfire in our U.S. urban neighborhoods.
Thank you for coming on our show, and hopefully we can have you back.
Certainly. I look forward to the
future.
opportunity. Thanks again.
And to our audience, if you liked what you heard, please subscribe and have a good night.